Good morning. This is Nick Freudenberg. I teach public health at the CUNY School of Public Health, and I am pleased to welcome you all today. It's a pleasure to welcome you to another of our urban food policy forums. Since the pandemic forced us to go virtual 10 months ago, these forums have become a really important way for us to stay in touch with our constituencies, to hear your ideas, and to share our thoughts. And we're so happy to see you all, and we can't wait until we can again combine face-to-face meetings with these virtual meetings. And just to let you know, we are recording today's session, and that within a week or so, we will post it on our website and on YouTube. And so if there are others that you want to share this with, you can send them the link. Today's forum seeks to talk about three big questions about federal food policy. And give me a minute to share my screen. The first question is, what can we do together to resume progress on addressing the major food problems confronting our city, New York, our country, and the world, problems that started long before 2016. And these include unacceptably high rates of food insecurity, a huge burden of diet-related premature deaths and preventable illnesses, a burden that contributes to economic and racial inequities in health, a food system indelibly shaped by the systemic racism that characterizes our nation's history and present, millions of underpaid, overexposed to risk food workers, and an agricultural and food system that contributes significantly to our world's climate emergency of global warming. Many of these problems have their roots in a political and economic system that values corporate profits over human need, and that manufactures inequality more efficiently than human and planetary well-being. So that's the starting problem, a modest start to our discussion today. And we need to ask how and in what ways last month's election changes what we can and can't do to address these problems. Second, we need to ask how we get started in rolling back the damage to our nation's food system over the last 4 years. Where do we start? What are the first 100 days priorities? And how can we focus our energies to, for example, better protect immigrants, repair safety net programs, restore federal food and agriculture regulatory system, and of course, control this terrible pandemic?
Nick, sorry,
yes.
Could you please just switch to full screen of your slideshow? Thank
sure.
you.
Sorry. And third, we face the question of how can we best work together? The food justice movement, broadly defined, is as diverse, opinionated, and in some ways divided as the faces on our screen this morning. Yes, we agree on some very basic things, but we also have deep disagreements about what is most important, how to bring about these changes, and what the priorities should be, and how to balance the need for incremental and transformative change. In the next 100 days and 4 years, how can we acknowledge these differences, but also find common ground so that we can actually make progress towards answering the first two questions? Well, that's our ambitious hope for this morning, beginning to answer these three questions. And before introducing and turning to our wonderful panelists, I want to show you 3 slides. The first two show you the results of a poll we sent out last month to the readers of our newsletter. And more than 100 people responded. And here's what they said, what you said, and thanks to those of you who responded, about priorities. And you can see there's a lot of agreement that food security and healthy nutrition are top priorities. And then you can see there's some others that also have some significant suggestions that we ought to be making these priorities. But then if you look in a little more detail, and this is a perhaps complicated slide to see, you can see there are about 20 issues that our readers think should be important priorities in food policy. So we're really going to need to work together to set priorities, to figure out how we can combine these, and to come up with a package where we can actually make progress. And I think our speakers will be speaking to many of these goals. And finally, we need to explore how do we go about changing federal food policies in the next 4 years. And I list here some of the possibilities that have been suggested by those who are active in food policy. And of course, there's a lot of emphasis on withdrawing the very harmful executive orders around public charge, around school food, some of which have not yet been implemented, and the rule changes, and to have the Biden administration issue new executive orders and rule changes. So what are the priorities there, and how do we encourage executive orders that will move things in a new direction? We need to pass new legislation. The opportunities for doing that depend a lot on what happens in Georgia in early January. But there will be opportunities for change no matter what, and we ought to be looking at some of the possibilities for change. We also have seen very clearly in the last 4 years how the courts, both federal and state courts, provide a forum for changing food policy. How do we use that? And what are some ways of using the courts strategically, especially as the Supreme Court has moved to a more conservative, more pro-corporate direction, more than ever before, probably in certainly in the last century. We've seen, again, in the last 4 years, many times when more progressive states instituted changes that could then set national standards in a field not related to food. We saw that very clearly with California's air pollution and car emission standards that really set the standards for the nation and the world, because the auto industry didn't want to deal with 6 separate state rules. So how can we use that approach in a new administration? And finally, we have always seen that the president, Congress, and the court follow public opinion as well as leading it. And on many key issues, civil rights, gay rights, support for immigrants, we've seen that popular mobilizations and changes in popular opinion led to changes. And how can we work on that both in the short term and the longer term? And with that, I would like to introduce our first speaker. Reverend Dr. Hebert Brown serves as the pastor of the Pleasant Hope Baptist Church in Baltimore, Maryland, and he's the founding executive director of the Black Church Food Security Network, a national association of congregations using their land, assets, and relationships with Black farmers to co-create Black-led food systems. And the questions that we've asked Reverend Brown to talk about include these, and we're so pleased and excited to have you here today. First, from your perspective and that of the Black Food Security Network, what do you think are the couple, 3 most important federal food policy changes in the next 4 years to reduce inequitable rates of food insecurity in Black communities? And second, how do you think the history of federal policy that has affected Black farmers and Black communities shapes what we need to do in the next 4 years? And finally, if you have time in your 10 minutes, and if not in the discussion afterwards, from your perspective, what roles can Black congregations in both urban and rural communities play in pushing for these changes? So welcome, and I turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Nick. I appreciate it, and thank you for the opportunity to be here. We'll see how far I get with these. I'm a Black Baptist preacher, and I can preach a sermon on any one of them by themselves, but I'll offer up and say initially, when I think about federal policy over the next 4 years or so, of course, my mind is drawn to the Farm Bill of 2023 and the things that we need to do now with respect to coalition building, with respect to study and research and organizing to get ready for the next Farm Bill and the ways that it will address nutrition, the ways that it will address food systems, hunger broadly concerned, and support for rural and urban agriculture, and so many other issues. So many times in my experience, when legacy organizations reach out to me with help with the Farm Bill, they reach out in the bottom of the ninth with 2 outs. It's way too late. It's way too late. And they want me to do my part to mobilize Black churches to get behind whatever angle that they're trying to lead with respect to the Farm Bill. So I'm trying to bang the drum as loud as I can right now that organizing with respect to the Farm Bill needs to be happening right now. That legacy organizations that have long been funded enough, resourced enough, and at the front of the line in terms of defining and shaping what advocacy for the Farm Bill looks like, need to move over and make room, especially in this particular climate where there's far more focus on the poison and venom of institutional racism and anti-Blackness broadly concerned. And so Farm Bill activism and organizing is something that I think we need to look at right now. I am encouraged by, when we talk about the federal level, I'm encouraged by the new chair of the House Agricultural Committee, Representative David Scott out of Georgia. I think that based on everything that I've read and seen from Representative Scott, he's spoken about the need for justice, racial justice in the food system. And he's talked about how we need to be fair when it comes to farmers, particularly Black farmers. And so I'm encouraged by him being in that position as the chair of the House Ag Committee at this time. I think we at the very least would have an open path to dialogue with him about what changes need to be made in the Farm Bill and in other policy with respect to food and health and hunger. And at the same time, I recognize that there are many in the food justice community, of which I am a part, who have considerable pause about Mr. Vilsack being floated as the next head of the USDA. They have considerable pause because of his record and the concern around the ways in which Black farmers and Black farming in general was said to be making progress under his leadership, and these are during the years of the Barack Obama presidency. But what actually was going on was Black farmers were faring no better under his leadership, and there were efforts to kind of mask what was really going on in Black agriculture. And so there's considerable pause in some of the circles that I'm in with respect to Mr. Vilsack. Many of us, me included, would have felt far more comfortable with Representative Fudge being in that role and in that place to help bring about some of the systemic transformative changes that we need at that level with the USDA. And so those are some of the thoughts that come to me with respect to the federal policy. I also think it's important, though, to think about when you talk about the Farm Bill and federal policy with hunger and food and the like, we got to study the impact of this with respect to the Black community, as you rightly said, and as you asked me to address. And so I think back to the New Deal of the early 1900s under President Roosevelt. And that New Deal had so many blind spots with respect to advancing justice for the African-American community. From the Agricultural Adjustment Act, which pushed a lot of Black farmers and off of land and out of jobs, those Black farmers who were sharecroppers and tenant farmers on white-owned land. The Agricultural Adjustment Act of 1933 pushed them off the farm because it paid white landowners to not have their land in production. And so a lot of Black folks lost their jobs and means of providing for themselves during that time. Also under the New Deal, and in that same time, you also had the Homeowners Loan Corporation, which produced the maps, these infamous maps that really set the course for redlining in this country. And the ripple effect of redlining is still going on. And so many of the communities today, particularly Black communities that are suffering because of food apartheid, the roots and connection to it go back to the Homeowners Loan Corporation maps. The farm service agencies that were receiving federal funds and not giving fair opportunities to Black farmers and landowners to receive federal funds to grow their farms and invest in infrastructure. And then the long decline of Black land ownership from the early 1900s to today, the centuries-long decline of Black land ownership and Black farmers in this country that has resulted in millions of acres of land being lost in the Black community. So historically, the Farm Bill and these federal policies actually have been policies that have advanced discrimination and oppression of the Black community. I think it's going to take transformative energy to push back against those legacies and invite something new. And I'll close then with this. How do we get there? How do you get to that transformative changes? From where I sit, organizing African-American churches is a part of the solution, As you said, Nick, change oftentimes is not led by those who have the positions in government, but actually change comes from communities, and elected officials are pushed to do what maybe otherwise they wouldn't do. And so I think, as so many organizers from the Black freedom struggle said, organize, organize, organize has to be the agenda. And that's certainly what we're striving to do in the Black church community. Many people individualize those who have come out of the Black church and been agents for social justice, like, for instance, of course, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. But individualizing him keeps one blind to the community that shaped and molded him and so many others. That community was the Black church community. And so I'm excited about what Black churches can do and what we are doing, not only to push changes at the federal level and local government, but finally also to anchor ourselves in asset-based community development, taking what we already own and what we already have to be the solution to some of the problems that we face on the day-to-day basis. Collectively, the Black church community is the largest landowner in Black America. When you think about what that land could do with production of food, it's a game changer. And that's certainly what we're doing, helping churches grow food on their land and connecting the dots and creating our own systems. Thinking about what churches have in terms of kitchens, what they have in terms of vehicles, and even the internal functioning and systems of a church, or even a synagogue or a mosque. Oftentimes we have health-related ministries in our churches. We have nurses in our nursing ministry in the Black church tradition. So these internal systems can be powerful not only for our local churches and communities, but also to the broader community as well. And so I would just say that we need to widen the lens of who we think or who we expect to be voices and players in bringing about the changes that we seek at the federal level or even down to local level as well. And I guess I'll stop there at this time.
Great, thank you so much. Really great start to the conversation. Our next speaker is Josh Kellerman. He joined the Retail, Wholesale, and Department Store Union in 2017 as Director of Public Policy, and he first connected with the labor movement in 2001 as an organizer in Oregon's Farm Worker Union. And again, I have some questions for Josh Kellerman to get him started. And again, we're so happy to have you here. The first is the pandemic and federal labor and other policies have had a really devastating impact on low-wage food workers over the last 4 years. And their circumstances were very problematic before that, of course, as well. From your perspective and that of our WSDU, what are the 2 or 3 key changes in federal policy that would better protect food workers? And then the second question, we hope we can have some of your thoughts on, what do you think are some of the strategies that labor unions, worker organizations, and their allies can use to advance these changes to improve the conditions of especially low-wage food workers? Turn it over to you, and thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks, Nick, and thanks to the CUNY team. It's great to have academic partners out there in the world. All the smart people at CUNY have been very helpful to us as a union who has many workers in the food supply chain. They've been really helpful in thinking through understanding the problems and identifying solutions. So thanks, Nick, and to your team. And also just want to give a shout out to Reverend Dr. Brown. Couldn't agree more with what you had to say. You know, what some of your comments made me think about what truly being an ally means. And I think one of the best ways that I think about this is when we're trying to work with allies, rather than saying to them, what can you do for me? The question rather is, what can I do for you? And I think that can go a long ways towards building the solidarity that we need to really make change. But anyways, my union, the Retail, Wholesale, and Department Store Union, we have about 40,000 members in the New York City region, about 100,000 nationwide. We organize folks in a bunch of different industries. Our base is in apparel retail, department stores, and grocery stores in the food supply chain, all the way down to poultry and pork processing in the Midwest and South. Organized food service workers, cafeteria workers, pharmacies, nursing homes, airline concessions, car wash workers, and more. So we're a general union, but our base is in food primarily and in retail. So in addressing the first question about key changes in federal policy, unfortunately I have 4, not 2 or 3, but hopefully I can move through them fairly quickly. Hang on, let me set my timer just in case. So the first is, you know, I just want to note the devastating impact that the pandemic has had on our membership. We've lost over 40 of our members due to COVID-19. These workers are mainly in meat packing and in grocery stores. And so, you know, I know the poll that was done of folks that received the CUNY newsletter said that COVID was in the workplace was sort of on the lower end of federal policy needs, but according to our members, it's the top issue. They go to work every single day fearing for their lives. They come home fearing that they're going to bring it to their family. And in fact, that's just what has happened. So the first thing I'll mention is that we really need what we're calling and sort of what's generally known as an emergency temporary standard on infectious diseases in the workplace. So this is would be something issued by OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, which supposedly is set up to protect workers in the workplace, but has completely fallen on its face during the pandemic. OSHA received over 4,000 whistleblower complaints between February and June of this year in relation to COVID and did not issue a single citation during that time. This is in spite of employers wholesalely putting their workers' lives in jeopardy. We have examples, and these are from union plants that we're able to address. And so ultimately workers came out generally okay, but you can imagine in workplaces in our union what happened. At one plant, an employer said they only had enough PPE for supervisors, not for the line workers. These are meatpacking plants. At another, the employer wanted to charge workers $3 per face mask. At another plant, the employer made separation barriers out of saran wrap. At numerous plants, employers were tying bonuses to attendance. So if you had, you showed up every day to work, you'd get a bonus, which obviously is the antithesis of what we want to encourage people to do during a pandemic. If they're not feeling well, they should be encouraged to stay home. And so we had sick workers showing up to places where there were no PPE and no separation barriers. And we had tens of thousands of members come down with it. These meatpacking plants became hotspots for their communities, led to community-wide spread of COVID-19, and ultimately had workers and community members die from it. So it really is criminal, and OSHA did nothing to address it. And we are hoping that the first thing that Biden does is issue an emergency temporary standard on infectious diseases that sets a floor for workplaces where you have specific enforceable guidance on physical distancing, mask requirements, and workplace ventilation. And we think that would go a long ways to ensuring that workers are protected. And to be clear, I mean, this is not just a worker issue, this is a racial justice issue. The majority of impact of COVID has been in communities of color. And that's largely because frontline workers are communities of color. The people that keep this country running are people of color, and we're not doing enough to protect them throughout the food supply chain. So that's the first one. Second one would be lowering line speeds at poultry facilities. So for those who don't know about line speeds, there's actually a cap on how quickly birds can move through a slaughter facility. And what that is intended as a regulatory device to slow things down, ensure that workers and the birds are as protected as possible. This may not sound like much of a cap, though, and that's because the federal government is consistently raising it over time. Currently, the line speed limit on poultry facilities is 175 birds per minute, which is 3 birds per second. Now, just to talk about which line we're talking about, and when we're talking about line speeds, this is about the evisceration line, where birds are, their organs are removed, the carcasses are cleaned and washed and inspected, and this is a highly automated line that honestly is capable of virtually unlimited speeds. The problem is around that line, where workers are hanging the birds for evisceration, and then after that, when the birds pile up for deboning, cutting, and packaging. And that is the most dangerous part of the poultry process. Line speeds are not set federally for the deboning, but when you have the line speed sped up for evisceration, it means everyone else has to speed up around it. And this is where you have workers, injuring themselves in multiple ways. Even just current data shows that poultry workers are twice as likely as workers in private industry to be injured on the job. They're 6 times as likely to become ill at the workplace. They're 7 times as likely to have carpal tunnel syndrome. And then, of course, the impact on the birds is terrible as well. And there's a humane solution. It's quite simple. It's just slowing down the line speeds. And that gives everybody breathing room, allows workers to spread out on the line so they're not so close to each other, particularly during the pandemic, and allows them to deal with some of the key issues around repetitive injuries. So slowing down line speeds is the next one. Also mention as a federal policy goal that's really top of the agenda for most unions around the country is passing the PRO Act, which is protecting the right to organize. The main reason unions have declined in this country over time is because federal labor law makes it extremely difficult to organize. While it appears like the National Labor Relations Act is set to protect workers organizing, it actually does just the opposite, makes it nearly impossible. And what we also know is that where there's workplace democracy, workers are safer and healthier on the job. Most of our union contracts create a worker health and safety committee at the job site where workers can raise issues with health and safety and have the power to negotiate with their employer to resolve those issues. Workers who have a union contract are protected from retaliation on the job, so they can be whistleblowers about dangerous conditions without fear of losing their job. And unions themselves have resources to help workers navigate workplace issues. We have experts on occupational health and safety on staff. We have relationships with politicians who can put pressure on companies to do the right thing. And we have access to the media to blast employers. And the PRO Act would essentially balance some of the inequities that make it nearly impossible to organize by having real penalties for retaliation, setting timelines for getting to a contract, protecting workers, protecting the right to strike, and also the secondary boycott, which has always been an important facet of community involvement in building worker power, and also addressing worker misclassification. And so the final thing I'll mention after the PRO Act is we really need a stimulus bill right now. And that's one of the best things we can do to support low-income food workers around the country who maybe have to leave work because they're at risk, at a higher risk of infection from COVID, and need unemployment insurance. Workers who've been injured on the job because they've been working too fast during the pandemic need workers' comp. We really, and generally workers and their family members need money in their pockets, and that's the best thing we can do to get folks back on their feet during the pandemic. So those are the 4 policy solutions. Sorry, I moved through them fairly quickly. And then just in a minute, I'll note a couple of strategies that I think labor unions, worker organizations, and their allies can use to advance these changes. Unions can negotiate directly with employers to improve conditions. So at some of these plants, these meatpacking plants I mentioned where they had these challenges around implementation of COVID-related policies, At a Tyson plant that we represent, we were able to negotiate a health and safety plan where a worker can shut down the line at any time if they're fearing for health and safety on the line. And there are no questions asked, no retaliation at all. And once that issue is addressed, then the line can get back up and running. This is an example of how unions on the shop floor can resolve issues, and shows the value really of how we can link a just food system to worker organizing. Other strategies used, I mean, it'd be important to win Georgia because of the split Congress. We're just not going to get much done legislatively. And of course, focusing on executive action is key. But we also know, I think if we learned anything from the Obama years, it's that we really need to maintain outside pressure, even when we have allies in the White House. And that's what will hold folks' feet to the fire to get things done. I think showing the interconnection between issues is really important. As I mentioned before, justice in poultry plants is racial justice and is immigration justice, since a large group of workers in the meatpacking industry are undocumented. So if we can raise standards for workers, we're raising standards broadly. But also, speaking to what I mentioned earlier, it really is also a question of what can unions do for other groups. And so we're really open to conversations about how we can support other issues and be in solidarity with you. It's not just about how we can support worker issues. So that's it. And thank you all for your time, and look forward to questions.
Thank you so much, Josh. A really good follow-up to Reverend Brown's talk. And I particularly like the specificity of your 4 suggestions, and I'll be interested to hear. And just to remind people, after we hear from our 3rd speaker, we will open up the chat line, and you'll have an opportunity to ask questions of the panelists in the final part of our discussion. Our 3rd speaker is James Parrott, who is the Director of Economic and Fiscal Policies at the Center for the New York City Affairs at the New School. His recent research focuses on the ongoing economic impact of the COVID pandemic in New York City, and an analysis of the magnitude of gig and other low-paid employment contract work in New York State. And the questions I'm asking him to speak to are, first, the combination of the pandemic, the resulting economic decline, and 4 years of Trump have left urban safety net programs and urban economies in precarious conditions. In your view, what are the 3 specific changes in federal, economic, social, and food policy that would best enable cities to address food insecurity and return urban areas to a more equitable and healthy future? And second, from your perspective, what role can New York City, the government, civil society, and residents play in putting good new ideas on federal food policy on the federal agenda over the next 4 years? And how do you think federal policy can make it easier for New York City to actually build back better? And welcome, and we're looking forward to your presentation.
Good morning. Thank you, Nick. It's good to be here and such a distinguished panel as well. I really appreciated hearing from the 2 previous speakers. Nick indicated that my recent work is focused on looking at what the COVID-19's economic impact in New York City has been. And that's been all-consuming because of, obviously, because of the nature of the crisis and the challenges that presents. And we have a long way to go in terms of beginning to really understand what the implications are and how to respond effectively and eventually build back better. These are enormous challenges, and hopefully here in New York City, with now that we're past the national elections of 2020, we're looking forward to the citywide elections of 2021. And hopefully there'll be a robust debate in New York City about how we can proceed at a local level. But today our focus is on the federal level, and there's certainly enormous challenges there. let me start by talking about, just to underscore the unprecedented lopsided nature of the COVID-19 economic impact. It's not like a recession in its impact. As we know from looking at New York City, and it's also clear that this is the economic pattern around the country, 3/4 of the economic job displacement has occurred in low-wage, face-to-face service industries, heavily populated by persons of color, by low-income workers, by workers with less education. It's affected the workers least able to rely upon their own personal safety nets to weather, an indefinite period of losing their job and their livelihoods and having their lives upended. On the other hand, those people working in the remote sectors like finance and professional services and corporate headquarters operations, information, media, technology, many of those industries which have a strong presence in Manhattan, their work life has been inconvenienced for sure, but many of them are able to work remotely. They still have their jobs, they still have their incomes, their companies have been doing all right. Tech companies and certain companies have benefited from the change in the economic landscape in recent months, and we see that reflected in the record levels on Wall Street. So against the backdrop of decades-long development of a polarized economy, if you wanted to design an economic event that would further exacerbate those inequalities, COVID-19 would be a pretty effective way to do that. So it's created this incredibly lopsided impact, which hasn't really been recognized in the federal response, or even in the response at the state and the local level, for that matter. There really needs to be an understanding of the need to share the burden that's been imposed on workers who have lost their jobs through no fault of their own. Their jobs and businesses have been sacrificed for public health reasons. And in my opinion, that creates a federal responsibility to make whole the economic lives of all those workers who have been affected by this. This is a different kind of perspective than what we see usually in a period of recession. The last 4 years have been challenging because of Trump policies, but because of local policies at the city and the state level in New York City, we actually were making significant economic progress, through February of this year, before the pandemic really took root. One of the most important things that was done in New York City by virtue of state law was a substantial increase in the minimum wage floor, which more than doubled the applicable minimum wage in New York City from $7.25 in 2013 to $15 an hour by the end of 2018. So that's a more than doubling of the minimum wage in the span of 5 years. That did a tremendous amount to lift the incomes of people in the bottom half of the income distribution in New York City. Because the federal data from the American Community Survey is not really, we don't have the details on that at this point. There hasn't been a lot of research to document the benefits that period of sustained low unemployment, rapid job growth, and increased minimum wages. A lot of that economic progress is now at risk because of the very industries that are most heavily impacted by COVID. I think the most compelling need now in terms of a federal response is not only the sort of federal relief, from fiscal relief for state and local governments to additional unemployment compensation, to expanded SNAP benefits, increased public health investments to ensure effective and rapid distribution of vaccine, and so on. We also need a commitment to rebuild the job base that low-income workers depended on. Because of the prolonged nature of this and the impact on the small businesses that heavily populate many of the face-to-face industries like restaurants, local retail establishments, local personal service establishments, we're losing many businesses. There will not be jobs to go back to, even if the broader economy were to rebound much stronger than what it is now. Those jobs are not going to be there. We will need federal assistance in the form of public service job creation programs, wage subsidy programs, and other things targeted to New York City and urban areas to recreate those employment opportunities. And if we don't do that, we jeopardize losing all of that progress that we've achieved in the last decade. New York City had also made some progress in an area that I think there really needs to be federal attention to more effectively, or not more effectively, but to have an effective approach to regulating the status of gig and other low-paid independent contract workers. New York City, through the Taxi and Limousine Commission, put in place a minimum pay standard for Uber and Lyft drivers that lifted the pay of 75 to 100,000 workers in that area, paid them the independent contractor equivalent of the minimum wage, and made sure that they were reimbursed for their all of the vehicle and other working expenses related to providing that driving. One of the areas where Trump policy has been particularly unfavorable is in allowing gig companies to continue to employ workers as independent contractors. One of the early tests for a Biden Labor Department and administration is whether or not to push back against the victory that the gig companies scored in California through a referendum in the November election to enact Prop 22, which, for those people who haven't followed that, basically allows the companies like Uber and Lyft and Postmates in California to continue to classify their drivers and workers as independent contractors, not employees, which would have been the case given the passage of a state law in California known as AB 5, which simplified the test for whether or not a worker is an independent contractor or an employee. So there needs to be federal action in that area to do something comparable to AB 5, to have a more simplified test to establish employee status. And I think we'll see an early round of that in Albany, because fresh off of their victory in California, Uber and Lyft are pressing for a similar approach in the state of New York. So as you can see, my approach to food security is mainly by advocating for ways to improve economic security, job security, and income security for low-income workers and their families, and to do that through labor and employment regulations, and also having a strong economy that creates sustained low unemployment, which helps foster market conditions that strengthen the bargaining power of low-wage workers. The federal relief is desperately needed. It's important that there be a significant component of fiscal relief for state and local governments that will enable them to preserve their budgets and avoid the necessity of making cuts in many other areas. Most government services in this country are delivered at the local level. And those services, the funding for those services come mainly through state and local budgets. If there's no federal fiscal relief, state budgets have to be balanced under state laws and state constitutions. And in many places, New York City can't run a budget deficit. It's compelled by state law to balance its budget. Without federal fiscal relief, there will be damaging cuts that will not only worsen the unemployment situation and create more job displacement, but will undermine funding that's really essential in this period for to take care of homeless populations, to provide emergency food assistance, healthcare services. The whole range of public services rely upon state and local government budgets. Thinking forward, we would like to see expanded federal investments in early childhood education. There's been growing support in recent years for that. There hasn't been an opportunity, obviously, in recent years at the federal level to do anything on that. Hopefully, that situation will change. One of the most important things, more broadly speaking, I think, clearly we still have incredible political challenges that we face in this country. We saw that very clearly in the results of the 2020 election. There are a lot of people who supported Trump who are serving as an obstacle to the enactment of effective government policies. What needs to be demonstrated, and this is going to take a wall-to-wall organizing effort in this country, we need to reestablish the principle that government can function effectively and can take care of its populations, and that people should be looking to government for economic security and for intelligent and informed policymaking in economic, healthcare, food security, and in every area. A lot has happened in recent years to undermine that confidence and the faith that people have in the ability of government. That needs to be reestablished. We need to do that at all levels. In New York, we would be better served if we had a city and state government that work together to address those problems. But we really need to put pressure on the federal level to address that as well. So let me stop there, and I look forward to addressing any questions. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, James. And I especially liked your explaining the connections between economic policy, fiscal policy, and food policy. I think we in the food world need constant reminders of that so that we don't stay too narrowly focused as we attempt to improve food security. This was a wonderful panel. We're gonna, Rosita, and let me take this opportunity to thank Rosita and her team for being the behind the screen success of this forum. So if you can turn on the chat, we welcome questions. You can address them to a particular panelist or to all of us. We'll get to them in just a minute. I wanted to show, I'm going to start with one question for the three of you, and I'm going to show a slide in a minute. But before getting into that, I wanted to acknowledge that no panel, as wonderful as this one was, can cover every vital perspective. And I wanted to note some of the ones that I hope in your questions in the chat, or perhaps panelists in this discussion period can address. And I'm going to mention four, I'm sure there are more. One is the health and nutrition perspective. We need to focus on the huge burden of pain, suffering, illness, premature death, and cost that our food system imposes on all populations, and truly it's all populations. Heart disease is the leading cause of death for rich people as well as poor people, but especially on poor people and people of color and indigenous people. The second perspective we need to focus on is a gender perspective. Not only do women hold up half the sky, they hold up way more than half of our food system. They play essential roles in every sector of the food system, and they experience some of the inequities of our food system. And any set of federal policies has to address those gender inequities. The third perspective that I think is critically important is the environmental perspective. We've all acknowledged that climate change presents an existential threat to human health, planetary health, and really the survival of our economy. And the food system plays an important role. How do we develop food policies that also address climate change? And the final perspective that we need to remember is a global perspective. We're not alone in this world. We have a huge share of the economic resources and the food resources of the world. And our, as a nation, holding on to those imposes burdens on other parts of the world. And how can we begin to move using federal policy to a global food system that is more equitable and better promotes human and planetary health? I want to start with a specific question and wanted to show one more slide. That is actually in some ways more optimistic news than what I mentioned earlier. And you can see that there's a fair amount of agreement on the top priorities from our survey. If you look at most important and very important, and those three, it's a little different from the list we looked at earlier when you combine those categories, are climate, COVID, and food workers. And could each of you talk just briefly, because I do want to open it up, what do you think are some of the differences in the food movement broadly constituted that we need to talk about to make progress on these three issues? What do you think, and maybe each of you could say what you think is the most important point of disagreement where we need inside the food movement more discussion in order to be able to move forward? And maybe Reverend Brown, I'll turn to you first.
Thanks, Nick. I think I'm drawn to number three in terms of looking at disagreement inside the food movement. I'm reading right now an article from Civil Eats about the ways that Black farmers were dropped from USDA contracts this year as they were a part of the massive food distribution effort. Federation of Southern Cooperatives and other groups, many other groups of Black farmers were a part of that effort, and those contracts were very helpful to them. And especially when you're delivering this food to Black communities, to a lot of us, it makes sense to have Black farmers in the equation of helping to feed Black communities. But having these farmers lose those contracts and not having the support they need is very concerning. And for all of the concern that I'm hearing now about Black farmers in the food movement and the food system, there's some room to grow in terms of concrete action. There's some room to grow, I'll say it that way, in terms of concrete action and prioritizing the ways in which resources are shifted to Black farmers and having Black farmers speak for themselves. I mean, there's a whole lot of speaking on behalf of and doing on behalf of, a whole lot of organizational and personal kind of middle groups. So I think there's some room for us in terms of internal to the food movement. We got some work to do before we get to creating new incentive for Black food growers, in my example, and farmers to use climate-friendly practices. We got to honor where Black farmers are right now. And I think the food and the environmental movement could be accused of having in many cases, a paternalistic approach to telling Black farmers what they need to do with their land with respect to the climate, but are not talking about what kinds of support they'll bring to the table, and not acknowledging the historic ways that Black farmers have been victimized, even by those who have first appeared as friends. And so that's an area where I think robust conversation and dialogue could happen, but I could probably pick any one of these, but that one first jumped off the screen for me.
Great, thanks. Josh, your thoughts on the question of conflicts we need to talk about inside?
Yeah, you know, it's an interesting way to think about these issues of the conflict rather than the agreement, but I appreciate the approach. It's important to air things. So one of the biggest challenges of unions working with on some of these broader issues is that often unions have organized the larger producers. And that's partly because as in a cost benefit analysis where you have not enough organizers on the ground to do the work, you're going to go after those facilities that really have larger numbers of workers and will sort of justify your multi-year investment in trying to win a contract. That's opposed to trying to organize, say, a small mom and pop shop where there's 5 workers. It still may take you a year to get there, and you only have 5 workers organized at the end rather than 2,000. So what the ultimate result of that is that unions membership is more centered in large employers, and large employers are often what's seen as one of the main barriers to social change, right? We know that the big corporations are often creating an unlevel playing field through regulations and others to the detriment of everyone else, and so there's a tension there that is very difficult to deal with, because unions every 3 years and in fact constantly are in dialogue with these employers. And if you're doing something policy wise that undermines their position, they're saying, hey, you're hurting us, that means you're hurting your members, we're going to have to lay people off, we're going to make this contract negotiation difficult for you because you've done X, Y, and Z. And so it's often why you see unions in this really difficult space of like how to both work with their employer and with the community who may have completely different views on what's important. So, that's it, whether we're talking about minimum wage, whether we're talking about climate change, all of that comes to bear in trying to negotiate that challenge.
Great,
so
thanks.
Just airing some dirty laundry is all.
Right. And James, your thoughts on the conflicts we need to talk about?
Yeah, no, that's a great way to approach the issue. Excuse me. I do think that one of the most important things that needs to happen to, again, given my approach to food security, is through better labor standards and economic security generally. We've had 4 years where we've had a focus on dividing and conquering important constituencies that we're all very connected to and concerned about in this country. So we need to pivot away from that. And I think that we've also gone through the longest period of time without an increase in the federal minimum wage. So fortunately, states like California and New York, many cities around the country have recognized the importance of lifting the wage floor for all workers and have enacted $15 an hour minimum wage laws. Half of the states are still stuck at $7.25. Most of those states are in the South. That is a powerful restraint on the ability of millions of Americans, persons of color, but also a lot of poor white families and households who have been unduly challenged because of this failure to raise the minimum wage. That would go so far in terms of allowing greater economic security that it creates the basis then for addressing a lot of the other issues related to healthcare and education, and environmental issues that need to be addressed. I really, was pleased to hear Reverend Brown's remarks on Black farmers. There's such an underappreciation of divisions within the food production sector between giant corporations and small farmers. I come from Illinois, where it's really hard for small farmers to survive in this environment, even when we have lots of federal policies that are doing wonders to sort of prop up the economic context for large corporations to dominate the food chain unduly. I think that's an area, we've seen even in New York, we've seen a growing appreciation in recent years for the value of farm to table production, for local food manufacturing in New York City, and the opportunities that creates for a lot of small businesses to flourish in inner city neighborhoods and so on. So food is a great entry point into creating new connections among the constituencies that are really important to us. So I think the kind of discussions that you're making possible at the Urban Food Policy Center are really important.
Thanks. We're going to jump into questions now, and we have a lot. And so I'm going to direct the question to a particular person and ask you to be concise if you can, so that we get to more questions. The first question is for you, Josh. It's from Kelly Moulton. Hi, Kelly. Given the safety and health risks of meat packing plants, are there efforts to involve workers in a just livestock transition and to help workers have jobs in other sectors that are better for health and the environment, especially as laid out in the Eat Lancet report that came out about a year ago? Josh, any thoughts on that?
Can you repeat the question about what was the stock transition?
Yes, just livestock transition. In other words, federal policies, is there the potential for federal policies that both protect food workers and reduce meat consumption for environmental and other reasons?
Well, I'm not entirely familiar with what she's mentioning, so I'm going to need to read up on this Lancet article. Or Eat Lancet article. It sounds great. I'll maybe speak to the bigger picture then, which is that it reminds me actually of the energy production, unions and workers and their transition to a climate future, right? A green energy future, where you really need to think about what a just transition looks like for those workers. And I honestly haven't heard any real conversations around, if we're going to reduce meat production, then we're going to have less jobs in meat production. What does a transition for those workers look like? And I actually think that it's probably a much easier problem to solve than in the energy sector, where you have in the fossil fuel industry very high paying union jobs, and you're transitioning often to low paying solar jobs or other jobs. Meat packing workers would probably be happy to have a safer job, and it's hard to pay lower than they already pay in meat packing. So I think potentially a transition could work well, and it's a lot about having clear leadership and clear goals for protecting the livelihood of these workers and ensuring there is disrupted and as little disruption and dislocation happens as possible, but that also these ideas and plans are being developed from the ground up. So there's engagement with the workers about what types of jobs are you, do you need retraining for? Can we build them in your local community so you don't have to move and disrupt your life, et cetera, et cetera. So I do think that that's a relevant conversation to have, and I look forward to learning more about, from this article.
Yes, we'll try and put it in the chat so that people can look at it. The next question is from my dear friend and colleague, Jan Poppendiek, the co-founder of our Food Policy Institute. And she asks, and I think I'd like to ask each of you to comment on this, perhaps from the perspective of your constituency. What do you think about universal basic income as a strategy to develop over the next 4 years? And maybe we'll start with you, Reverend Brown.
Thank you for the question. I got to be honest, as soon as you said, the thought about universal basic income, the first thought that came to my head, very honestly, was, what about reparations? Because I think if we're talking about that kind of deep sensitivity to the ways in which the financial resources of this country needs to be distributed in such a way that there's greater equity and greater parity and opportunity for all citizens of the country. All right, yep, I'm with you. And we also got to do some homework. We got to do some, I love the idea. I support the concept, and the energy around the reparations movement this year has been higher than in other recent years. And so I think we do need, I would welcome the opportunity to look closer and study deeper with respect to a universal basic income. Many historically have talked about, I think even Dr. King might have talked, at least gestured toward that as well with the Poor People's Campaign. And so I think it definitely can be found in the Black freedom struggle historically. And I think that reparations should be party to that conversation as well. But yeah, I welcome the question and the conversation around that.
Great. Josh?
Yeah, I mean, yes to reparations, and also I heard a very interesting debate a while back on it that was from, like, on the one side, libertarian thinkers who were supportive of it and left-wing thinkers who were critical of it. And it seemed to me that the main challenge of this is that on the right, they're talking about a universal basic income replacing our existing social service programs. So you'd essentially fold them all into this not means tested program where everyone essentially gets a check every month or whatever. And I think that's a real problem, because then it creates a single target for the right to cut our support system. So if we were to, right now we have multiple different systems to support people, from food programs to income programs like unemployment insurance and workers' comp to multiple other housing support. So there's sort of, despite its fragmentation, it's also more difficult to undermine, because there's so many different options to sort of to work in it. So I think, yes, it might work if we could really think about how to protect it right, but I also think it creates a much easier target for the right to take down the last sort of vestiges of our support system. So, thanks,
James.
I wholeheartedly endorse the comments of the two previous speakers. Those were right on. So I'm not going to repeat any of that. I think it's important to recognize that we have tremendous income and wealth inequalities that, as I've discussed, have been intensely exacerbated by the COVID situation. We need an effective tax policy that redistributes those resources. Reparations is an important objective that needs to be addressed as part of that. We need to institutionalize ways of making sure that people can have opportunities and can prosper through their own efforts. Full employment, I think, is an essential precondition of any just society. We're a long way from that, and we're in a deeper hole. We're further away from that, given the effects of the COVID economy. So I think our priority should be, number one, getting back to restoring employment opportunities, and at the same time, revamping our tax structure in this country, mainly at the federal level, to redistribute resources in a meaningful way.
Great, thanks. The next question builds on this a little. It's a really important question. Again, I want to ask each of you your perspective from the constituencies you work with. The question is from Susan Sternberg. Thank you, Susan. The COVID pandemic has had particularly devastating impacts on women's employment. Can you speak to from your perspective, what are the policy needs that will support low-income women, both in work, but also in addressing work-family conflicts, And she notes that hunger, women food workers, she notes the press is mostly focused on professional women's careers, and there's this huge problem with low-income women. James, you want to start this time?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And obviously we're seeing real disparities in terms of the impact on men and women in this COVID environment with because of what's happened with the school system. A lot of children are learning from home, and the responsibility for overseeing that, disproportionately has fallen on women's shoulders. I think I think there's an opening for this. I think there's growing support and recognition for a significant federal investment in early childhood education in the most comprehensive way. So not only to increase the availability of that, which will do a lot to address the childcare needs that predominantly women are responsible for, but also the people providing that care and that early education are predominantly women. So we need to improve the accessibility and affordability, but also the pay, the salary, and the benefits for those early childhood educators. So I think that would be a substantial way to address two or more very compelling needs.
And a third need that could address, and a fourth, is food as well, that having strong food programs, there's an evidence base that good nutrition in early childhood years supports lifetime health. And there are also a number of promising models, both from the United States, but also from other countries, of using childcare centers to provide food assistance and food support to the family as a whole, especially important in pandemic times. And similarly around healthcare, childcare programs are a great way to make primary healthcare, mental health care available to families who most need it and are most excluded from other programs. Josh, your thoughts on meeting the needs of low-income women?
Yeah, I mean, as a retail workers union, our base are low-income women workers in the retail sector. And we've done surveys of our members, and always in the top 3 priorities of our members, childcare is front and center. So we've had as one of our legislative priorities for decades now that we need to expand access to childcare. We need childcare subsidies. We need, childcare that's has hours that work for working people. So early morning hours, late hours, night shift hours, all of those things, so that workers can maintain their jobs in confidence that their kids are being well cared for. And of course, as James mentioned, the corollary to that is that the workers who are providing the childcare are well compensated to ensure that they're actually getting the proper care. Your kids are getting the proper care they need. So certainly, and it starts at the federal government, because it's frankly very expensive to provide that level of childcare and to provide it universally. And local governments just simply don't have the resources to do that adequately. So it really is a federal ask. And although it's administered at the local level, I do think that the city and state can do quite a bit to help. And we do have some programs that we've advocated for to support low-income workers and accessing childcare subsidies that come from the state. It's called the Facilitated Enrollment Program, primarily for union members who are low-income in Manhattan and work in the retail industry. And they're supported by a fund at the state to access childcare. And it's just a drop in the bucket, but we really need federal support on this.
Right, and New York City established a principle, at least, of universal access to pre-K and 3K, and now needs the resources, especially threatened in this economic climate, to fully implement that. Hebert, do you have thoughts on this question?
Yes, I mean, I don't think I can add too much to what James and Josh have already shared and what you just offered up as well, Nick. But I will say I am curious. Beyond policy, I'm curious about the ways in which cooperatives, mutual aid efforts, and the like could also be a factor here, whether with federal support or with support from other community anchor institutions. My center of gravity is more so on the community organizing side of things. And so while I'm very appreciative of the work that needs to be done with policy, I think the way that my orientation is that pressure and organizing help to shape and push policy forward. And so it's a part of my impulse to start there. And with this question, I am thinking about what co-ops, matter of fact, what cooperatives and what mutual aid kind of efforts have been doing this year, what has been going on, and where the embers burning, where with some greater support it could even go further. And so I turn to books like this, one of my favorites, Collective Courage by Jessica Gordon Nimhart, who writes about the history of African-American cooperative economic thought. And I just offer that up simply because I think someone said it earlier, it might have been you, Josh, talked about even with an administration that you feel would be more open and favorable to some of your asks and requests, or it might have been you, James. One of y'all said some genius stuff. But even with that in place, it's actually not the time to relax, because we've seen that the work in some ways has been more difficult because there's been this kind of, like, no, it's not the time to sigh. It's actually the opposite time. And so mutual aid societies, cooperatives and solidarity circles in that way energize me, because it's like, that's something that we can do. That's something that women have done historically, as this book and so many others has pointed to, irrespective of who's been in office or not. And so I'm grateful for that tradition and legacy, and I want to do more study there.
Right. And such a rich tradition in this country, as you said. The last question before I ask a closing question from our panelists is to you again, Reverend Brown, from Ruth Goldman. And she says, are there any specific federal policies or pieces of legislation that you would like to see in the next administration and the next Farm Bill?
Well, you know what, a dear sister, one of my leaders and mentors, and Dara Cooper and our wonderful family at the National Black Food and Justice Alliance have offered up, and with so many others as well, legislation specific to Black farmers and justice for Black farmers. Senator Cory Booker and others are organizing a talk soon to give more details about that. That's something that I'm very interested in and looking to learn more about, and thankful for all of the various groups that have had a hand in helping to give some language to this act, which would particularly target support for Black farmers. And if I can find the specific link, I'll put it in the chat. But that's something that just hit my desk, I think last week or 2 weeks ago or so. That's something I'm keeping my eye on.
Yes, and I've had the pleasure of working with Dara as well. So glad to hear her name called out. So the last question, and thank you participants for your wonderful questions. I think we really richened and deepened the discussion. We focused mostly on what to do, what are the policy changes? And in my last question, I'd like to ask your thoughts on how to do it. And from the constituencies that you work with, municipal governments, labor unions, congregations, what do you think are the strategies, the political and organizing strategies most appropriate, especially in the next year, especially in 2021, to have us move forward on food policy? And why don't we start with you, James, and then Josh, and then Hebert.
Well, that's a tall order.
Yep.
So,
and in a minute or two, especially Paul.
I would think that it's really important, given the political polarization in this country, to really think about ways that we could connect people organizing in different states, and people in cities with people in states that are more rural oriented and agricultural oriented. I think that would be a real eye opener for a lot of people in terms of their personal involvement, and an important way to build solidarity beyond the ways that we might otherwise expect them to evolve.
Thanks.
Yeah. How do you answer that question? I really think it comes down to activating and mobilizing our base. And how we do that is not necessarily through smart or strategic policy, but through a vision for a world that is one that people are inspired to live in and to be a part of. And so I think that, it's important. I think that the left particularly gets caught in sort of being policy wonks about the changes we want, rather than the vision and sort of the cultural changes that we want to see that are really inspiring. And so I think that, to me, that's partly the task, right? The task isn't to pass the PRO Act. The task is to change the workplace from a feudal system to a democratic system, and that's the difference between a policy wonk approach versus like a more visionary approach for changing people's lives and changing the world that we live in. So I feel like that's partly what we need to do, is to not only keep ourselves oriented towards these visions, but to make sure we're talking about our work in that more vision-y way, but also ensuring that the leadership, the political leadership, Biden and others, are hearing that vision constantly, and that's sort of filtering through their minds to the actual policies that we're doing. But the policies aren't the idea, the vision is. And I think that's what I'd leave y'all with.
Amen. That's what we say in church. To what I just heard from both James and Josh, amen. That's amazing. And I agree in terms of these connections. For the past 5 years, the Black Church Food Security Network has been doing just that with rural Black churches and urban Black churches, urban ag, farmers in the near or in cities, and legacy farmers down south. And I'm just having a blast being a pollinator, network weaving these connections in small town America and inner cities, and us seeing what can we roll our sleeves up to do ourselves. And I shared one book already. Let me give one more on the way out the door, because I think another part of this is digging into our history to see where we've done this before. Like drawing strength from, in Ghana, they have a symbol called Sankofa. It's a picture of a bird looking backwards with the egg in its mouth. And it means go back and fetch. So in other words, go back and get the wisdom you need in order to fly forward. One of the places where I get wisdom and draw inspiration, my sister, Dr. Monica White, wrote a book called Freedom Farmers, Agricultural Resistance and the Black Freedom Movement. This text is a deep well for me, because it proves that in my heritage and in the history of this country, you've had people who have organized, pulled together what they have, embraced asset-based community development before it was a thing, and put forward some very progressive and inspiring transformative changes. And if we've done it before, I believe, by God, we can do it again. Thank y'all so much.
And thanks to the participants, to all of you for your participation and your questions. And thanks especially to the panelists for your great thoughts. Just to add a few closing thoughts. The first is, I think, the power of health, well-being, and social justice as connected thoughts that can bring people together, and especially well-being and social justice as rooted in our day-to-day lives and our daily experience. And I think if we can find new, better, more powerful ways of connecting those things to people's day-to-day experience and to the political structures, we'll be able to more fully engage things. The second, with apologies, wearing my hat as an academic, and thanks so much, Hebert, for putting this forward, ideas and books as a way of engaging with people. I think we need to put out new ideas, and that's what turns people on and gives them the power and passion to keep moving. So we need to be the originators of new ideas. And part of the success of the right wing and the conservative movement is they've put ideas out that resonate with people for better or worse. And we need to be moving more actively on that front. And finally, to my mind, the greatest challenge to our success is the belief that there is no alternative to our present world. And we need to be loud and clear in our day-to-day actions and in our long-term actions that there is, in fact, another world, a better world, and that we can make it. We've done it before. We can do it again, as each of the speakers has said. And I look forward to doing it with all of you over 2021. So thank you all, and stay safe. Take care of yourselves.